You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons. It's Matt, and I am sitting near the 111th Pennsylvania Monument on Culp's Hill with author and Professor James Broomall. Is that how you say it, James Broomall?
Broomall, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. And you prefer James or Jim?
Jim.
Jim, me too. Okay, James is just too formal. He has a book, Private Confederacies, and it's put out by the University of North Carolina Press. He is assistant professor of history at Shepherd University and director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. No relation to Mary Tyler Moore, right?
It was her father.
It was her father?
Yeah. So Mary Tyler Moore had relatives who fought in the Civil War, and then she was part of the movie Gore Vidal's Lincoln, and it sort of kindled an interest in the Civil War era. And so she made the decision to go back to the family, one of the family homes, which is in Shepherdstown, Conrad Schindler House. She was the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Schindler, and bought the house for the university, donated it to what was then the Shepherd College Foundation, and then named it in honor of her father. So that is our local celebrity collection.
Is interesting. I had no idea when I asked that question. I was just trying to be funny. All right. Well, that's pretty cool. So Private Confederacies, the subtitle is The Emotional Worlds of Southern Men as Citizens and Soldiers. Why did you decide to choose Confederates for this?
So I became very interested in grad school with Southern history, all facets of it. And there's a lot of contradictions. There's a lot of difficult subject matter. And there is, at least among white Southerners, this kind of legacy of defeat, right?
Mm-hmm.
This catastrophic contest of the mid-19th century reshapes that society literally into the present day. And so I knew I was interested in some sort of Civil War topic. I sort of went all around, and I became increasingly interested in the very end of the Civil War, this period in which the armies begin to demobilize, men start going back to their homes, and I had this central question: how exactly did white Southerners, how did Confederates kind of make sense of this catastrophic defeat? How did they make sense of the collapse of the plantation complex? How did they make sense of a society that was, at least for them, in upheaval, a society that was being redirected in these profound ways? And so I actually started in this period of 1865. And as I dug deeper and deeper into the content, I wanted to take my narrative actually back into the antebellum era and then sort of move it past the Civil War era into the Reconstruction period. And so it was just these questions that I couldn't sort of get out of my mind. And you know, at the heart of it, I'm an empiricist. I love primary source materials. And it was the primary source materials that kept speaking to me and directing me and sort of asking new questions. And so that's why it sort of went in that direction.
Because you're seeing in the antebellum period a change, or maybe say at the beginning of the war, you're seeing a change in these men's attitudes and writing styles. Is that what it is?
Yeah. So, and I'll keep it brief, but like...
No. Take your time.
There's this assumption, this prevailing assumption, especially among scholars, that, you know, in the antebellum era, pre-Civil War period,
right,
white Southern men are very much structured by these external postures and poses. They're very sort of closed off emotionally. They're not willing to disclose elements of their identities to certainly other men, maybe only to loved ones. And I said, okay, so that makes sense. So what I was confronted by were these letters in which soldiers were writing to other soldiers with a great deal of emotional transparency and disclosure, writing to loved ones in which they were revealing really heart-wrenching stories, profound sense of senselessness in the post-war period, uncertainty. And it sort of seemed as though that facade was starting to shatter. And so as I was getting deeper into the wartime and post-war stuff, I started asking more questions about, well, then what did they look like during the pre-war era? Mm-hmm. And while on one level that persona is certainly true and certainly guides them in their public interactions, if you start looking at diarists, for instance, you see a lot different portrait because they're writing essentially to themselves about themselves. And so I started finding men grappling with what they refer to as melancholy, what today we would call depression. They might also call it the blues in the period. And so they were sort of grappling with their position in the world. Very sort of familiar ideas. They were as they were going into adulthood, the responsibilities that they had in this world, how did they start to make sense of those? And so they seemed in some instances, a lot more vulnerable, a lot more emotionally transparent and available than I otherwise had thought. And that then really forced me to look at that pre-war era more deeply. And that in turn forced me to look at the wartime era more deeply, to understand how we get to that post-war period, how we get to those types of disclosures. And so that's why I wanted to go back.
Okay, yeah. Well, and that's more interesting, I think, because you can trace it over time and the different events that shape these men's lives. And now, but so I guess to my original question though, the Southern men, because it was such a catastrophic change, that's why you focused on them. Is really the short answer, right?
Yeah, that's the short answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned the diarist, and I think I want to make sure I got who was William J. Clark? Was he the guy who had the diary that he picked up on the battlefield and then just continued it? Was another guy's diary?
That's another figure. That's, I think, last name was Shand.
Shand, yeah.
But well, do you want to go Clark?
Well, go ahead. Go give me Clark though. Is he is he a typical example of what you're talking about or not?
He is. I mean, Clark, I think what's so interesting about Clark is he's a colonel in a North Carolina regiment. The reason why I became so fixated on him is I looked at his post-war diary. And the post-war diary has a lot of revelations. He was wounded in Mexico during the Mexican-American War.
Right.
So he already has a pretty significant physical wound that he's carrying into the Civil War era. He's a man who's in a lot of pain.
Right.
During the Civil War in '64, he's wounded outside of Richmond. Shell fragment shatters part of his shoulder. And so by 1868, he has these diary entries that are just, feeling great pain today, feeling very irritable. He started to drink a lot more. He started to have a really difficult relationship with his wife. He seemed to at least have been verbally abusive. His wife, interestingly, in one private letter tells their son, your father's kind of out of his mind. You need to be respectful, but you need to really heed what he says quite carefully because he's no longer himself. But what was interesting is on the public side, he seems pretty well adjusted.
Right.
He is in charge of the New Bern Academy, the small school. He becomes a Republican, which isn't popular among many people in Eastern North Carolina. Yeah. But nonetheless, he's this sort of political figure. He's active in newspapers. He's in correspondence with the governor. He seems very well adjusted. Yet privately, his life's a mess. His wife stays in Richmond. In Raleigh. He goes to New Bern, North Carolina, so they're separated for long periods of time. His children are kind of, I think having a lot of trouble understanding the dynamics of the family life. And so here's a man who is really profoundly changed by the experience of wars, not just war, but wars.
Right.
And so I became really interested in those types of figures where if I could follow them over long arcs of time, I would have something. Now, the problem is, of course, for anyone who's read Civil War correspondence and letters, there's, a lot of men who are killed in this conflict. So their stories end.
Right.
62, 63, 64. But Clark is one of those figures where I had antebellum, wartime, and postbellum materials on. And so I was able to sort of follow him over this longer arc. And so he's a lot more interesting to me in that regard.
During the war, how was he? Was it the wound in '64 that really kind of set him over the edge, or was he always kind of a little off?
A lot of his contemporaries said he was combative and disagreeable, and he didn't get along with his officers, so he was quarrelsome. But there was also a petition that was written in '64 that really sort of lauded him, and he clearly had a lot of support among his peers. And so I think he probably was a slightly difficult personality to begin with, and I think these two painful wounds just augmented those elements. And like I said, he definitely succumbed to alcoholism by the post-war period.
The way you describe the idea of what a man was in the antebellum South, the more I learn about the antebellum South, the more I think that people successfully, for that period of time before it was all over, lived in a fantasy world. Mm-hmm. Tell us what the image of a man and what a man was supposed to be and do in the antebellum South.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that's important to recognize is there's different social classes, and so we often think about the antebellum South through the lens of the plantation aristocracy. So these are individuals who were slaveholders. These are individuals who probably wielded a good deal of political control. These are individuals who often were involved in duels or contests of honor because public reputation was so profoundly important. Those ideals and ideas trickle down among the yeoman classes, certainly, but eye gouging or wrestling was much more common than dueling among those classes. But for all Southern men, I mean, this is a very strict social racial hierarchy, right? There's a very specific structure to this society, and both by law and by custom, white men are patriarchal. White men are ultimately in charge of those whom they deemed dependents, and that was their recognition by law. And so that does create, I think, a very sort of martial identity among these men going into the wartime era, and they are very prickly. I mean, what's so interesting about the Civil War to me is you have among Confederates, you have this officer class who's fighting a war, yet in many cases they're fighting among themselves because of these contests of honor, these ideas of reputation. I mean, in the post-war period, it certainly happens among Northerners, and we can look at the Hunt, Hancock, and all those debates and stuff. But there are so many of these newspaper battles that ensue in the post-Civil War era about what exactly happened and who was right or wrong, and Longstreet is vilified because he is going to attack Lee in public, and so therefore all Lee's defenders come after Longstreet. And so there is this public persona that I don't want to diminish or undermine. But it's like you said, it's also, I think, grounded in some fantasy, right? Do they truly have control over women, children, the enslaved? Absolutely not.
No, it's just by color of law that they get to keep it, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's important to also recognize that, you know, women are themselves important actors, as are children, as are the enslaved. I mean, it's very clear. And in fact, in the example of Clark, his wife was a published poet. She was a published writer.
Oh, really?
She had a really important reputation in both antebellum and postbellum North Carolina. She was in correspondence with Zebulon Vance. She was pretty famous, and she often wrote under a pseudonym because of the dictates of the period. But I mean, she was a recognized force, and so I think that probably also led to some of those dynamics where Clark comes into the household in the post-war period and wants to sort of reassert his identity. She'd been running the household for 4 years while he was gone, and so that in turn leads to this friction, basically.
And that's kind of a thing that I notice through what I was reading in the book seems to come up a lot is when the men hear about life back at home during the war, as the war wages on and they really start to miss home and everything, it's for some of them, it kind of pains them to hear it because they long for it and they can't have it, and life goes on without them. So
this is something that I've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about, and it's one of those veins in the scholarship the historians have thought a lot about as well. So on the one hand, you can never diminish the fact that soldiers desperately miss home. It's very clear. There's countless letters that talk about a quiet day in camp, being sort of just disgruntled, being around the company of men constantly, and just desperate for a letter from home. It's very clear. On the other hand, what I sort of argue in here is that with all that said, and I'm not trying to diminish that, with all that said, Civil War soldiers are thrust into these all-male communities. They're around other men. That's the whole point of the military, right? Your core group are your messmates, and then your identity is grounded in the regiment, the brigade, the division, the corps, so on.
Right.
And so they form, in essence, these kind of ersatz or ad hoc families. And what starts to happen, and what you're hinting at, is the home front and the battlefield are always connected, certainly, but they also become increasingly sort of disconnected as the people at home are enduring their own hardships. Soldiers are increasingly sort of distancing themselves from that home front, not recognizing necessarily those hardships.
It's just naturally,
saying, how can you understand? How can you understand the experience of combat? How can you understand the experience of war? You can't. And so there are these pretty snippy letters between husbands and wives and between family members. And again, that's not to say that they still don't love them deeply, which they do,
Sure.
and they're thrilled when they actually do mobilize and are able to go back home. But it does create these different arenas that are sometimes in competition with one another as they're trying to go through this experience. And it is an unparalleled, unprecedented experience for most of the people I look at. Now, there are, of course, a core group who are pre-war officers and have spent long periods at frontier posts and so on. But by and large, these volunteer armies are composed of just that, volunteer citizen soldiers,
Right.
men whose identities are grounded as much in the civilian world as they are in the martial world.
They, you mentioned someone, I forget his name, but in 61, his letters are, he's itching to get in a fight. He and the boys are ready, and let's have at those Yanks and all that type of stuff. But by 1863, it's a much different song he's singing.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was common among a lot of people, but I guess what I'm getting at is how when the soldiers finally saw the elephant, as they said, was there a feeling of what the hell did I get myself into and now I can't get out?
I think one of the things that's very...
Hello, Gettys nerds. It's Matt, and I hope you enjoyed that preview of our premium content that can now be found over at patreon.com. I just want to let you know that Addressing Gettysburg will always have free content for you to listen to in the forms of our narrative episodes like Antebellum to Chancellorsville and the upcoming episode entitled Invasion, June 1863, appendix episodes, and our wildly popular Ask a Gettysburg Guide episodes. But episodes like Antebellum to Chancellorsville take months to produce, as things are now. I hear from people almost every day asking how long until the next episode is finished. And the answer is, when I have the time, I can do it. Your support at Patreon can cut down the time it takes to produce an episode by months. Maybe you don't care about that. Maybe the Ask a Gettysburg Guide episodes are what you like, but they leave you wanting to learn more. Well, fear not. More is what Patreon is all about. Patrons receive access to new premium episodes each week. These episodes are straight interviews or discussions with licensed battlefield guides, rangers, local historians, academics, authors, public historians, people from the Gettysburg community who do impressive things, and frankly, just about anyone who can talk on a subject related to Gettysburg. I want to make sure that the interest you already have in Gettysburg is enriched with our premium content. Your support means the world to me, because that means it will be easier to produce content that will bring Gettysburg to more people and, hopefully, more people to Gettysburg. And the podcast episodes are just the beginning. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become a patron. I thank you in advance.